Speak up a little bit. Nice to see you all. Lovely to see some familiar faces in the audience as well too. Welcome to the Royal Society Portrait Painters Annual Open Exhibition too. I shall try not to move around too much and make too many blowing noises on the microphone at the same time as giving an introduction. So welcome and thank you for joining us tonight to discuss one of the many roles that painted portraiture can play within society. That's surrounding the complex issues of social taboos of facial disfigurement. The Royal Society of Portrait Painters, or RP as it's known, is a unique organisation as it is able to showcase the many approaches to and experiences surrounding painted portraiture, from the sitter to the artist, and from the artist to the viewer. If you look around the walls, and I hope you will see evidence of the diversity of these approaches. For some, a portrait is a measure of technical skill and competence. For others, it's a record of likeness, or a way to celebrate an individual. For a practicing artist, it can be anything from a way of earning an income in order to supplement their ongoing work, or it can be a career in itself. For the sitter and the viewer, it can be an introduction and a fascinating and revealing process that measures or records a symbiotic relationship between the artist and the subject, one where permission is granted and insight is offered through reflection, or a visual verbalization, if you will. In this scenario, the artist is able to explore and find out about an individual or group within society using his or her skill as a painter to communicate that which cannot be said or is perhaps best summed up visually. It is this process in itself that forms the basis of tonight's discussion, and it is my pleasure as President of the Royal Society of Portrait Painters to provide the platform to do so. So, if portraiture could be a tool with which we discuss social issues, then how? Well, as portraiture revolves around the depiction of individuals, it is, or can, offer a mirror to society. As an art form, the investment in understanding is that which we develop through life. We recognise and interpret faces as part of our upbringing, and as such, communication and interpretation is neither exclusive or elitist. It's owned by us all. Sometimes we might not be able to give words to or understand our tacit responses to individuals or representations, and that is why, from a portrait painter's perspective, tonight's conversation is important. The link between Changing Faces and the RP goes back to 2002, when Changing Faces first sponsored an award for the portrait which is most outstanding in the way it communicates with the viewer. Tonight's debate came about because of the RP's desire to explore painted portraiture from a range of perspectives, looking at the areas where practice crosses over into wider social discourse. As a long-standing partner, Changing Faces, the facial equality campaign, aims to transform society's attitudes about disfigurement. By greater collaboration, we aim to introduce disfigurement as an issue to be discussed, debated or outed. Over 1 million people in the UK have a disfigurement to the face, hands or body as a result of a birthmark, congenital condition, accident, warfare, post-cancer surgery, skin or eye condition or facial paralysis. Our first impressions of people who have disfigurements are often less than positive, purely because of the value judgments that are placed on appearance alone. In any encounter involving someone who has a disfigurement, these assumptions can leave both parties feeling unsure how to behave, anxious about saying the wrong thing, or looking in the wrong direction. So what happens when a portrait painter and a sitter with a disfigurement come face to face? How does the painter address the subject in order to communicate character and personality as well as physical likeness? When does the portrait become successful? Can the production of a portrait be used to open a dialogue about facial disfigurement that overcomes communication barriers? How could a portrait be used to engage the viewer and challenge social taboos? Tonight you will hear from 3 artists and 2 of their sitters who have examined these questions and more during the process of sitting for paintings and for portraits. All 3 paintings are on display. You will also hear from the viewer's perspective about what a portrait of somebody with a disfigurement can convey and what it reveals about ourselves and our sense of identity. Tonight will be filmed and made available in the near future, hopefully through the Royal Society of Portrait Painters website, so please be aware that your comments may be recorded, but hopefully not used in evidence against you. Without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished panel and to hand over to Sandy Nairne, Director of the National Portrait Gallery, who will chair tonight's discussion.
Sandy has chaired numerous conferences and seminars worldwide. In 2005 and 2006, he chaired the National Museum Directors Conference Working Group on Cultural Diversity, and his most recent book is The Portrait Now. If I can hand you over to Sandy Nairne. Thank you.
Alastair, thank you very much. First of all, I'm going to test on sound. If I'm speaking like this, I have got a mic here, but I'm just going to test whether you can hear me like that. Can everybody hear if I'm talking like that? Yeah. Okay, we are mic'd up, but I'm just aware that we don't want the mic or the sound to get in the way because we want you part of this. I'm going to introduce our panel members, and then when I've introduced them, we're going to have some conversation, if you like, or some animation from them, and sort of perhaps a little bit between them, we'll see. But then, of course, I'm very keen to bring you into this, and we have a roving mic so that we can hear from you and you can join in. We're going to run until 8 o'clock. Alastair has, in a sense, already made an introduction by his position of being the president of the Royal Society of Portrait Painters, but he's also a leading painter himself, of course, in that office, and teaches and leads work at Loughborough, and has had a number of very important commissions, one of which, as we're going to hear about, is his portrait of Marc, which is over here, and we're very pleased that Marc is with us himself. Marc is the chief executive of Henshaws Northwest, which is a charity working to support blind and partially sighted people in the Northwest. Marc has done many other things on the charitable front, but as I say, he appears in two forms, in painted and in real form with us this evening. We also have Brendan Kelly on my right, and Brendan's got his great portrait, my brother Paul. Brendan has exhibited here at the Royal Society, also with us at the BP Portrait Award. He was the winner of the Changing Faces Award for his portrait of Viv Richards, was that 2007, I think, the year before last, and has undertaken a number of very important commissions, including recently major commission from the military. And we'll hear from Brendan in relation to his work. James Partridge, in my far right, is the founder and chief executive of Changing Faces. James and I actually go back a very long way indeed, because we turned up at university at exactly the same time and had rooms next to each other, so we've known each other over a long period. It means that I'm a very long-term fan, is what it really means. And James has, over these many years, as you know, done wonderful things, both in the publication of his book in 1990, in the formation of Changing Faces, and the campaigning work he's done in this country and abroad. And the partnership already mentioned by Alastair between Changing Faces and the Royal Society of Portrait Painters, I think, is one of the most innovative, if I may say so, between charitable campaigning and professional organisations that I know of. Now, I also can introduce Heath Roselli, on second from my left. And Heath is a portrait painter who has had a number of distinguished commissions, has exhibited with the Royal Society. She exhibited at the BP Portrait Award in, I think, 1997.
Yeah.
With a rather extraordinary portrait of Evelyn, someone who'd survived breast cancer, was a very prominent part of that year's award. But in a way, she's here with Michelle Gemelos, and Michelle is here also in two forms, because she's here as a portrait by Heath, as well as here in her own right. Michelle, born in Brooklyn, New York, but resident in this country, working as an academic and a teacher in Cambridge, and involved with Changing Faces for some years, and we're very pleased, Michelle, to have you as well. As I say, what we want to do, and Jonathan Jones has provided us with a sort of special element, because I think everybody has on their chairs what I've been teasing Jonathan is really the pub quiz. But Jonathan is very important to us, because Jonathan is an art critic with The Guardian, a writer and broadcaster, and some of you will know that Jonathan published, I think, a very important piece about his own experience in relation to Bell's palsy, and through that talked, and I think he'll talk a little bit this evening, about the relationship between his experience and thinking about art, which is what he does as his professional work, but shared with all of us, in a sense, that in another form. So Jonathan, welcome too. Now, in order, as I say, to start off, I wanted to start really with Marc and Alastair and see if we could draw perhaps Marc. I don't know whether first you'd like to say something about how your portrait by Alastair came about, and then we can hear from Alastair as well. Marc.
Thank you. I heard about the project through my association with Changing Faces, and was instantly fascinated by the idea. I've been photographed on countless occasions, and I'm used to sitting for photography and seeing my image in that format. But I really liked the idea of actually engaging with an artist over a long period of time. The whole concept of what a portrait artist could bring out, rather than just a representation of what I looked like physically. It was the whole idea that the artist, that Alastair, would actually spend time getting to know me, and I wanted to see how much of that would come out in a painting. So it was something completely different for me, and it was a very exciting idea.
I think maybe you should explain, was it, Marc, your idea, or was it Alice's idea, or was it an idea between you? How did this idea come about?
Well, my background is one where I'm interested in looking at portraits as, I suppose, tools for documentary, or I suppose if you want, reflective spaces. So the idea that I might choose to paint somebody whereby the process and the design of the portrait was one of discovery at the same time, but which I could track the discourse of the sittings. I was quite interested in looking for sort of subjects to work with. So because of my connection with the Royal Society of Portrait Painters and therefore the Changing Faces Foundation, it made sense to me. So in January this year, when James rang up, I was still in my back garden. He said, we need to do something slightly different this year. And we'd been talking about the idea of a debate with the RP as well, too, so that we could discuss, you know, a more diverse range of issues around portraiture. We thought it might well be a good idea to maybe actually produce a painting. It's important for me as well, too, because over the years as a practicing portrait painter, I've come across so many instances, and those of you who are practicing portrait painters in the room will be aware that there are times when you realise that the process of producing a portrait yields so much more information than necessarily fits into the final portrait, or you find out so much more about the person, or the process becomes slightly cathartic. And I was very keen on trying to find people that I could work with so that I could maybe enter into that discourse a bit more and question my own approaches to painted portraiture, which essentially up to that point had been through a commission-based framework, really. So that's how the idea grew.
I mean, Marc, I think just to stretch a little bit on the point you just made, really, tell us a bit more about the ways in which being painted felt different from being photographed. As you said, you've been photographed on many occasions, but what then emerged in the process? That, I mean, how did the pose come about? How did the format and formation of it, and then what happened in the process?
I think the biggest difference was the discourse that Alastair and I had during the whole process. I mean, we started with a general chat, getting to know each other, bringing out bits of my character, things that might inform the pose, the setting, and the whole time we spent running up and down and around in my house looking for the perfect place, moving all the furniture and getting the right props. It was that process that it felt more that there was more of me going into this than anything else I'd done before.
Did you find, I mean, I think sometimes for any subject being the subject of an artist, in a sense staring at them, did you find that a difficult process, or was it just a straightforward process of having Alastair focusing just on you and you having to be rather intensively this subject to a painting?
No, I found it quite a pleasurable experience because I was being stared at and studied in a completely different way. It wasn't a medical illustration anymore. I wasn't being photographed to see how my neurofibroma looked. I was actually engaging with somebody who was actually looking for something else inside me. He was looking to, yes, represent the fact I looked different, but that wasn't the be-all and end-all. There was more to it than that. That Alastair was trying to find something deeper, which was perhaps a tall order for him, but he tried.
Ambiguity is a wonderful thing.
And now, Alastair, just to sort of get your reaction a little bit more, I mean, did you find it involved different processes, or did it, in a sense, evolve like any other portrait you might have taken on? I mean, okay, you've explained that it started in a different way, and we can understand that between you you created this opportunity. But did it then, once it got going?
I suppose I treated it like a normal commission to start with, but I'm just kind of fascinated at looking at people's faces, I suppose. So it was nice to be given sort of a license. I mean, as a portrait painter, you've always got a license to look at people anyway. But in this particular instance, it was a really good opportunity to have a really good study, to be honest. In a situation where perhaps there are usually quite a lot of politics about staring, and you're not really sure about what to do or how to address these kind of things too. So it was nice to have the opportunity to do that. I mean, essentially, we went through the usual process that I usually go through, which is to sort of chase people around the house with the camera, trying to find whereabouts they get good light and whereabouts they feel comfortable and whereabouts they sort of emerge and feel quite natural, I suppose. And then we sort of design the composition and work from it. So that was relatively straightforward. But after a while, you start to think about, you start to look at the subject as is, rather than, and the politics, I suppose, go out of the window, really. So,
I mean, well, that's probably a topic we should come back to, because I think if the politics go out the window, then maybe that's where we all find them in other forms. I think the point about staring is extremely interesting. I mean, there was a remark that actually Michael Palin made on visiting the Portrait Gallery, I think, last year or the year before, where he said, well, of course, I like the Portrait Gallery because it's the place in which you are licensed to stare at other people, which you kind of can't do on the street. So I thought that was interesting. Jonathan, I wonder whether we could come to you and hear a bit about your experience and reflections and thoughts on this.
Well, hang on. Hi. Right. Well, I have to apologise for producing this rather strange sheet of images. First of all, I thought I was going to be talking a bit longer. I'm going to give you an entire history of Western art. But just to recap, I wrote an article on this subject last year in The Guardian after I had Bell's palsy a while ago, fairly recently. I mean, which is a condition where it happens very suddenly and it affects one side of your face, the muscles. Muscular weakness, it's described as it was diagnosed by Charles Bell in the early 19th century. And nothing else has been discovered about it since then. Doctors tend to see it as a kind of, partly because it's a harmless condition. It doesn't actually, it's not, it really is just, it's a strange experience. You have to be careful with your eyesight, it can be affected, but essentially it's just it's a strange experience, and it's a temporary experience. So, this was at the most I'd say it was a sort of an insight, sort of a temporary journey through the looking glass from being somebody who, thought of themselves as quote normal looking to somebody who in the street looked different, just temporarily. And there was I had a very intense case of it. It was and it made me think. It made me think a bit. It seemed almost ironic. It seemed almost like, in my mind, it was almost like the art critic's illness, because being an art critic and looking at art a lot, looking at portraits a lot as well, something I've written about before, and you're suddenly having this kind of illness, which is basically an aesthetic condition, something that just really just affected your appearance, and that's. So that was strange, and so that in the end I couldn't quite resist doing a confessional journalism thing and writing about it. But I met James and interviewed James as part of the piece as well, who gave a very different perspective, a much more knowledgeable and deeper perspective to it. And so, I mean, it's certainly, I only had this temporary experience. But what it happened, the piece that I wrote coincided with the opening of the great Renaissance portrait exhibition at the National Gallery, and one of the works in it is B, on my little sheet that I've given you, which was a work by Domenico Ghirlandaio, great 15th century Florentine artist, Michelangelo's teacher. And this is a drawing, a deathbed drawing of an old man who has, and I hope you can see it, but he has a deformed nose, basically. He had a sort of massively deformed nose. And this drawing was the basis for a portrait that was commissioned by the old man's family, presumably, which is today in the Louvre, which is really, and when I spoke to James, it turned out that they have it in the office, the Changing Faces, because it is really an extraordinary painting. And first time I saw it years ago in the Louvre, it's like, it's just one of the most fantastic portraits in the world. And it's a fantastic portrait because it very honestly and realistically captures what's distinctive and strange and unusual about this old man's face. He's in the painting. He's caressing his grandson. He's looking up at him with a kind of wonder and love, and it's a very dignified and touching image. There's no time to go through all these, but this is a very quick tour of Western art. A is a Roman portrait bust. This man is not disfigured, as it were, but he is. It's just an example of the very realism is a very old tradition in the portrait. Roman portraiture was extremely realistic, warts and all portraiture. Of course, the phrase warts and all, which is usually credited to Oliver Cromwell, does imply that you should portray, as it were, disfiguring blemishes on the face. And that idea of truth in portraiture is very old. It's certainly there in Roman art. And there's clearly two sides to it. There's artists artists have always been interested in this subject, sometimes with what you might call a kind of macabre relish, sometimes in ways that we might find disturbing or unhelpful. As an art critic, I have to argue for the unhelpful, as it were. I don't think it's the job of the artist necessarily to produce good images or virtuous images or, the images we might consider to be helpful. Leonardo da Vinci, that's the image E, that's one of Leonardo's caricatures. Leonardo da Vinci was fascinated by different faces. He described going to see a woman in a hospital who was fantastic of face. But his drawings, I don't think anybody would want to use his drawings as sort of positive images because they're clearly very cold but they're very disturbing images, as indeed is a lot of modern art. And you could talk about people like Otto Dix in the First World War, Francis Bacon. But not all modern art is, I think, F. This is really a quick tour, but F, Picasso. I think Picasso is an interesting example of how modern art, there might be a very positive, as it were, tendency in modern art to simply to get rid of the idea of beauty, to erase the difference between beauty and ugliness, to blur the boundary, or to do more than blur. In Picasso's case, I'm not sure if beauty and ugliness are words that can be applied to his art at all. He seems to find a fascination that goes beyond that. And in this particular image, he's contrasting his idea of what Rembrandt, his kind of caricature of Rembrandt, with a classical beauty. So it's, and the images at the bottom are not somebody who's disfigured. They are all the same person. They are Rembrandt. They're self-portraits by Rembrandt done in 1630 when he's trying out different expressions. And Rembrandt, I guess, is the example in art history of an artist who you could say that he would probably rather have portrayed a disfigured person or somebody with a face that was, unusual than somebody who was conventionally beautiful. He makes everybody look. He is interested in he's interested in the full richness of humanity, and he paints people in a way that goes beyond appearances. I guess. I think all these paintings. I would think these portraits are really interesting and really admirable. And behind them, I suppose I'd say somehow lies the example of Rembrandt, because it shows how deeply the portrait can go beneath the skin, and that's why I think the portrait is actually a very profound and humanising way of looking at this subject.
Jonathan, thank you both for sharing your experience and also giving us the quick tour. We recognise that we could, I think all those who'd like to have a longer tour through art history, we can organise it for later on. James, I wondered whether you wanted to just say a bit about why, from the Changing Faces perspective, you'd seen, Jonathan's already told us about his experience and about looking back and thinking about the relationship into art, but I think it's very intriguing to know why you took such an interest in painted portraiture.
There are three quick answers to that. One is that I had, as a student meeting Sandy, I had to confront in a mirror my own very changed face after a major accident at 18, and I knew that something was going on in my brain cells that was very, very challenging to my own conditioning. I had grown up with a certain set of aesthetic values, I think, that I didn't really know where they'd come from, but I knew that they weren't very comfortable with what I was looking at in the mirror. But of course the mirror lies, and the mirror is a back-to-front image, and particularly if you have a disfigurement, it's extremely distorted. And so I became interested in photos because that seemed to tell me more, and then film. But actually, when I started looking at portraits, there was something extra here. And of course, there's a history. You know, photos only go back so long, but portraits go back and back and back. And so I started to become interested in how, as a culture, we capture things in painting that say something about the values of the society in which we live. And of course, modern art, and Picasso you mentioned, I mean, that was just so freedom-making. It was liberating for me to find that actually some painters were not conditioned by the same sort of set of value judgments that I thought I had grown up with. And actually, in literature too, I found that feminist literature was immensely liberating for exactly the same reason, because it sort of said, hey, well, wait a second, we don't have to accept all this. And I suppose, just coming to the final thing here, our Face Equality campaign is really designed to have a series of conversations to try to challenge whether our culture actually needs to think really quite hard about where these value judgments come from. And it seems to me that art is particularly portraiture, is a very classic place to start. And incidentally, I think we should arrange this tour with Jonathan, because I don't think I've got anything like enough knowledge yet. But one of the most interesting things for us in doing this portrait exhibition each year, and thank you to Alastair for that privilege, is the chance to see how people do capture something more than the external. I mean, my external is incredibly important to me, and please don't say it's the inside that counts, but there's that combination of the inside and the outside kind of mediated through a cultural lens, which is what the portrait painter is doing. And so, without going into the psychology, because we can talk about that a bit more later on, but that's why I'm interested in portraiture, and I think disfigurement in portraiture is particularly challenging, and there are very few really good examples of what I would call liberated portraits of people with disfigurements. Most of them are either covered up, and there's one classic one of a man who had a very major port wine stain on one side of his face, who was a great colleague of Betchman, and it was a fantastic musician, and every single time he's painted, you only see one side of his face. And this is 1935 or something. So, you know, we need to bring this subject out from the shadows. So, you know, this is why we think this is important.
James, thank you. I mean, I'm sure that we should come back to the psychological, because I think you've long argued that thinking about the psychological is central to how we might understand relations. And I think we know equally that even in the straightforward questions between viewer and portrait, actually there are such psychological questions about how any of us approach subjects we may not know, generally don't know, as we approach them through portraits.
And just his point about it's just an aesthetic condition. Were it so juster, you know, it isn't. It's the face is such an important part of our anatomy that we meet all the time. We're meeting constantly, and so we'll. No, of course, but it's a lovely juster phrase. I shall use it more often.
Can we? I wonder whether Heath and Michelle, we can come to you, because I think we'd be fascinated to know about the lovely portrait here and how that came about. What was the beginning of that? And then
Sure. Well, would you like to start? All right, I'll start. The beginning was I was listening to Radio 4 and I heard something about changing faces, and I was so incredibly moved by what I heard. I thought, this is something I would like to do something towards, and it kind of followed a series. I've been painting disfigurement for 13 years now, and it kind of came to me by accident. I didn't search it out, but I discovered that once I'd done one, then more and more people kind of came to me and said, you know, I'd like you to paint me. I thought, hang on a minute, there's a bit of a need here for this. And then I heard this appeal and I thought this would be fantastic to be able to do something to help this charity. So I rang them up and they brought Michelle and I together, really.
But Michelle, let's ask you, I mean,
Yes.
had you thought about being painted? I mean, had that been in your mind?
It had never crossed my mind to be painted. I too had been photographed for medical reasons from very young age, and always under the gaze of people who were incredibly concerned for my well-being and my health. And I'm happy to say that through the course of, let's call it medical staring, I guess, nothing was ever discovered, but there's a long, long record of my image through the years, so about 33 years worth of these images. So it never ever occurred to me to have my portrait painted. But what was very interesting was I happened to hear about this initiative and hear about Heath's interest in portraiture at a point where I was going through, I guess, what you'd call a kind of transition, an important transition in life. I had just finished my graduate work. I just left the place where I'd been living for quite a long time, moved to a place right outside of Cambridge, and was preparing to get married. And so when the idea was raised, this idea of why don't you sit for a portrait, I thought, well, that's a fantastic opportunity, in a sense, to reflect on identity transformation at this time. So for me, there was quite a lot invested in it when I sat, but I couldn't possibly know what was going to come out of it because I'd never had the experience before and really knew nothing about portrait painting. I've learned quite a bit in a short period of time.
So how did you, I mean, it's rather like a question to Marc and Alastair, how did you set up the pose and you're looking wonderful. We can see the wedding
we
celebration.
thought hard about it, didn't we?
But,
well,
we
didn't.
We're bound to ask
Take a lot of thought.
whether the swing is important, the woods, the trees, the symbol.
All of it.
Tell us about how did this come about?
There is a lot of symbolism loaded into this painting. I felt, as Michelle and I first met at the coffee shop at Ely Cathedral, and I thought to myself, should I ask Michelle how I'll know who she is? And then I thought, well, that's silly. And of course it was so, I mean, immediately we set eyes on one another. We had an instant rapport. We went off and had a cup of tea. And the furthest thing from my mind was the port wine stain. It could not have been further from my mind. And we engaged eye to eye. And really, we haven't stopped talking ever since, I guess. But I think it was an absolute non-stop dialogue, which is why I've painted Michelle mid-conversation.
So this is really, we should understand, it's not so much as a wedding portrait as a conversation portrait.
Yes. Well, it's a little bit of everything. It is a little bit of everything. Everything is symbolic in this painting. The flowers are symbolic because they're rather different. They're not what you might expect. And yet I hope they're attractive and beautiful, and I hoped that would mirror the fact that normal is not necessarily beautiful. I think society has told us that, you know, we've got to be normal. And why? We should be celebrating our differences, I would have thought. So I thought, let's paint something that's a little bit different. We have the swing, which is a kind of carefree, happy, you know, go with life idea. We have all 4 seasons, which also speaks volumes, I hope. And really just the wedding dress. I mean, a girl on her wedding day has wonderful expectations, and of course it's a wonderful day, it's a celebration. People have a sort of idea, a sort of fixed idea of the perfect wedding day, and that is really, it's a kind of move on in status for you too, I think, isn't it?
So yes, I was going to say, Michelle, did things sort of, as the process went on, did it then, I mean, you said you learned more about portraiture.
Yes.
But did it also change other things through that process?
It did. I mean, it gave me a chance to perhaps reflect on the whole idea of companionship. And it's something that I think quite a few people in my lifetime have often expressed a kind of concern. When I was quite young, you'd have very well-meaning relatives saying, you know, well, it might be very difficult for you, but you're, you know, sweet, or sort of hanging on different kinds of you know, attributes rather than skirting this whole issue. And so when I was growing up, I wasn't in the least fixed on the idea that I might not find a companion, or that I might not get married. I had absolutely no anxiety about it at all, until of course it came time to prepare something like a wedding, and so all sorts of new anxieties come forth. But I wanted to just pick up on something I think that you started to say. We have certain expectations, and I was completely inundated with images of society's expectations of the perfect bride, or a person commencing this kind of life. And it seemed really intriguing to me to tackle this kind of idea of a bridal portrait. It's not at all what I expected I would be inclined to sit for. If you wanted a picture of me in my everyday pose, it would be sort of sitting at a desk, ripping my hair out, writing countless articles or sending emails. But I quite enjoyed the fact that we sat for this portrait because it gave me time to think about my companionship, and the fact that I don't feel particularly lucky to have found my companion, although I am, and he's in the audience, so I should reiterate that. But I feel that in some ways the experience is, I don't want to really hang on the word lesson, but I just want it to show that although it is about what's on the outside, getting to really know a person takes time, like the portrait, like the wedding, which was just one day in a very long relationship, which was a presentation, in some ways a chance to celebrate something. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot going on.
I think that idea of public celebration and how the wedding is, you know, of course, one of those moments about public celebration, but I'm sure all the portrait painters in the audience here will be delighted if we can re-establish that every wedding should have a painted portrait. And, you know, push away all those photographers. Okay. Brendan, I wonder whether we could turn to you, because I think it'd be fascinating to hear a bit about your wonderful portrait of your brother.
The picture of my brother, first thing I was going to say is that it wasn't a commission. I kind of do quite a lot of commissions, and it's not very often I've got a gap that I kind of do my own thing. And the origin, actually, of the picture, I didn't know anything about changing faces or anything at the time, but the origin of the picture really came about with me asking myself, you know, what makes a good portrait, and kind of questioning that, because often I have to paint people I don't know, and you kind of have to paint them, and then I really want to ask, what do I want to do? What would be the best thing I could do as a portrait? And I kind of had a hunch at the time that that the people you know the best, you might be able to kind of tap into something that you can't tap into when you just go and turn up at someone's house and paint a portrait of them. And so I kind of started selecting, thinking of friends I could paint, thinking of family members I could paint, seeing if there was someone out there in my close group that would give me something that I could connect with. And I pinned it down to Paul. And Paul, my brother, he's 6 years older than me. And just to tell you a little bit about him, he was born, basically my mother had a car crash, really bad car crash when she was seven months pregnant. She broke nearly every bone in her body, and Paul, obviously, in the womb got kind of smashed up, basically. And he was born, he was kind of well when he was born, but he was actually born with Bell's palsy. And consequently, a few other complications, but completely paralyzed down one side of his face, blind in one eye, and basically that's Paul. He's lived with it since birth, and he's looked a bit strange But yet, when I was growing up, it took me a long time to see that. You know, when I always just saw Paul, you know, when you're the younger brother, it's just normal. You know, that he's just Paul, it's just normal. And it took me a long time, and often there's people saying, even my mum, I think, often used to say, well, no, he's actually got disabilities, he's handicapped, he's like, has a disability, he's disabled. And I said, no way, no, he's just like everyone else. And it took me a long, long time to kind of get that as I grew up. And so also I'd kind of, when I'm thinking, well, who could I paint the best? And I'd often done drawings and stuff with Paul as I was growing up. And it'd often kind of been quite easy for me to do, and I felt I kind of connected it, I kind of got his likeness quite quickly. So I decided, right, he's the man, this is the one that's going to be my big picture, and the one I want to do. And then I realised, wait a minute, he's not normal, he does have this disfigurement. What's it going to be like if I paint this big picture of someone with this massive kind of disfigurement on his face? How's that going to be received? And so I had to kind of go around a little bit and kind of do some thinking. The other thing I thought is that in making a good portrait, in making a truthful portrait, I couldn't really paint him without somehow addressing the car crash, because the car crash is what made him what he is. It's profoundly affected all our lives in my family. And so I felt I had to address that in the image. But yeah, when you look at painting someone, you try to get their personality across. It became very, very clear to me that Paul's personality is a very, very sensitive chap, very, very gentle man, a very kind brother, and how to combine the violence of a car crash with something, with a personality that's gentle and sensitive, was a real problem for me as a painter. On top of that, the other thing that I had issue with in conceiving the image was people's perception of Paul with his disfigurement. And certainly at the time, and you go back to like the early 90s, Paul had an awful time at work in Scotland, and he's got a degree now in computer programming. And he had a job, his first job was quite good, then his second job, which is kind of what this picture's about, was awful. He'd get, by that time he was about 35, intelligent bloke, okay, he's got a physical, disfigurement, intelligent bloke, but he was getting people like youth scheme workers at age 17 coming in, being promoted straight ahead above him. He was doing the most menial task. And I got, it dragged his life down awfully, and I was angry, and I kind of felt, everyone's ignoring him. What, why? He's my brother, he's really nice, can you not see that? And at my point, this is a point in the concept of the picture. The picture's big, the picture's his face, because I'm saying, notice this guy, notice him. Don't ignore him, he's not stupid, and that's why it's big. That's why when I was lucky enough to get it up in the BP Award, which was fantastic for me, because I had a chance. There's like 250,000 people visit the BP Award every year, and I had a chance to have this picture up there, and I go, yeah, look at this guy, don't ignore him, and so that's what happened with the picture. But really, for me, the challenge for the picture, I said, was really technically getting that the violence and the gentleness together. And I'm proud of it, and I hope I've done it. And that's kind of what the picture's about.
Yeah, well, I can remember the moment when I was chairing the jury when we first saw this, and actually it still has the same amount of impact now as when I first saw it. It had a huge amount of impact then, knowing nothing that it was by you, but it remained for me as powerful as ever. Now, I'm rather aware we've had wonderful contributions from our panellists, but time moves on, so I think we might. We've had questions around staring. We've opened up questions of perception and psychology. We've talked a little bit about celebration, but I think this is the moment to draw in your questions and comments. We've got roving mics, so that's probably a good thing, and it'd be nice to know who you are, if I have to say that. So who'd like to start? Someone here.
I am Rosa Branson. I am a full-time, I've been painting 7 hours a day for 60 years.
Fantastic.
And a lady came to my house who had completely paralysis down one side of her face, and she said, I'm looking for a job as a cleaner. And I looked at her and I thought, you look like a Picasso. Yes, I'll have you. And she came in and she spoke 5 languages. She was brilliant. She was a wonderful woman. And I completely forgot there was anything different about her. And that's the effect she had on me.
So did you make a wonderful painting of her?
No, but she just inspired me. I wasn't painting portraits at that time.
Right.
I was painting still lives, actually.
Right. Very good. Who'd like to come in next?
What I was thinking about is when you were saying that you'd been photographed a lot of times medically, so you've been subject to the medical gaze a lot, and you sort of implied that you weren't sure what they saw or how useful that was, because you compared it to your relationship with being painted for the portrait. Do you think those photographs were useful in any way? And is there a way something could have been different to make them useful? Is there something they could have seen that they didn't see? Or is it just part of the process?
It's very difficult for me to know whether there was something more than a desire to determine whether something was malign or benign. In my case, all of the photographs were part of a record to determine whether there were any significant changes in the shape, texture, position of my birthmark, nevus. And I think when one is between, say, age 3, which is probably when I became aware of the fact that I was being brought to medical centers for this kind of monitoring, and then through my teenage years, all I got out of the process, to be perfectly frank, was a sense of relief when I discovered, or when my family anyway were told that there were no significant changes that could be determined through that process. That's not to say that everyone who took medical photographs over those years were equally standoffish or seriously clinical to the extent that there was no engagement. Some were more engaged, I guess, in that way than others. But it was interesting that it was always to determine whether or not things had gone terribly wrong or things had taken a turn for the worse. So it was a very strange long-term process for me. Yeah.
Been different?
I just ask again.
Sorry, in that context, do you think it could have been different?
I think it probably could have been. I mean, I think at the time I couldn't imagine a way in which it could have been. I mean, I think putting a child's mind at ease, that the record was something more than just to determine whether something had become cancerous, let's say, or and somehow dangerous, would have been good. I mean, there were a couple of people, particularly at New York University Medical Center, who were very engaged, and these were people who were used to taking photographs of, say, preteen age children, and there used to be a banter and a kind of camaraderie. But it's very, very difficult, and I think in my 30s, kind of appreciate how difficult it must be for them, where they're there to try to determine something quickly. They need to be able to provide that evidence. That's evidence for medical professionals. So yeah, it could have been different.
James, do you want to comment on this?
I have to say that I think one of the most fascinating medical artists was Henry Tonks in the First War, when he went out to the trenches and with pastels managed to capture. And if any of you have been to the Wellcome or the Royal College of Surgeons and seen those, they are fantastic portraits, and yet they have a medical purpose to them. And I wanted just to get back to something that Alastair said about relationship it seems to me that one of the great advantages that portrait painters have is that they have the chance to develop a relationship, which is very, very hard for the photographer. And Marc, you may have been through a whole day sitting with a photographer. I haven't. By and large, it's quick, 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 snip, snip, snap. And that makes the whole process that much more meaningful, and relationship is one which and I'm liable to verge into psychology at this point, but relationship is the complex bit for somebody with a facial disfigurement, because so much comes through the face in our relationships with others, and the face is, when it looks like this, it's the signaling box has got some complications, you know. I often listen to that, you know, Blackadder, and Rowan Atkinson in the trenches when he does that wonderful, you know, dogger, German bite. You know, and that's what it's like. It's as if the signals that we are sending out are kind of going through a nasty process, and something in the ether confuses it, and it confuses relationships, which is why I think work problems occur, relationship problems, school problems, and so on. So I think there is a huge value in the art of portraits because of that time and to build relationship.
At the back, I think there.
My name is Taya, Sheeran, Burke. I'm a portrait painter. I just want to say, I've spoken to a few painters on this issue, and those of us who have unfortunately occasionally got to do portrait commissions of middle-aged men retiring from institutions really like the idea of painting somebody with a very interesting face, be it disfigured or otherwise. And in the process of painting, one does objectify in a sense, and is looking for greens and purples and how to draw it, and gets very involved in the face. But I also hear from the sitters here that they feel a sense of empowerment by being able to plead their case in this process. I've got a funny feeling the artist might have the upper hand here. I mean, for example, I came across a very beautiful man on in a tube station who had half his face missing. And I really thought I really wanted to paint him, but I felt I couldn't approach him like I would approach other interesting people I meet, because of this objectification. In a sense, he's being looked at all the time. How do you get it across, say, I want to look at you, but in a really good way? I mean, is that a problem?
I think what I want to do is, there's a couple of other hands. Let me take the other questions, and then we'll do a roundup from the panel. So yes, sir, you.
Yeah, my name is Edward Ofosu. Actually, my question is for the gentleman over there, the one who was painted, the one in the chair there. And I wanted to find out if, after the painting was finished, he kind of felt that there was this kind of inner beauty that has been able to be captured in the painting. Did you feel any kind of connection that there's this inner beauty that has been captured through the painting?
We'll round these up, so we'll come back to these from the panel. So the question of whether an inner slide, I think this is really to you, Marc, yes. The question, we can come back. There was someone over here.
At the risk of being lynched by what I sense is a room full of portrait painters, I'd like to defend photography.
We have another photographer here. We have photographers. We're very pro-photographers.
I'm both an artist and a photographer.
I wasn't attacking.
No, I didn't feel attacked, but I'm making a defense nevertheless. I would just like to point out, I mean, I draw and I paint and I photograph. And what is interesting is that one can achieve the same relationship with one sitter and model using a camera and not a paintbrush. And I have had the sort of comments that I've heard tonight come back to me from some of the people I photographed in terms of feeling empowered, feeling as though the sitting has shown them a side of themselves that they never experienced before. And I think it's quite important that, what we're talking about really is the art of looking and not the medium. And I know, look, I love painting as much as anybody in the room, and I'm passionate about portraits, but I also love photography as much as I love painting, and I would like to, make a case for photography as a valid medium for recording the human being. I'd also like to just, again, at the risk of seeming odd, I mean, I find the disfigured face incredibly beautiful, and it's strange because we have an idea of what classical beauty is, and yet the human being is so incredibly varied and different. And I think to some extent, our idea of what beauty is fed and encouraged by the media's portrayal of what beauty is. But actually, if you look at all the people in this room, we're all very unconventional in the sense of what is true beauty. And I think when one discovers a face that is actually very different, it's like discovering a rare flower or an unusual moth. You think, wow, another part of this incredible continent of the human species that is actually different from myself. And I find a very rare beauty in it. So I just wanted to put my hand up and say, I think disfigured faces are amazing.
Very good. Now I'm going to say we're going to run out of time, I'm afraid, but I've got one here, and then one over there.
Hello, I'm Daphne Todd, and I painted James Partridge a few years ago. I think we both did it as an experiment. I thought the colours and the different sorts of skin he had were lovely, and I know that I paint the surfaces. What I saw, though, after a matter of minutes, probably hours at the very most, was an incredibly attractive younger man. And I don't know to this day, so I'm going to ask him the question, whether what I painted was just the surfaces, which is what I was looking at and being moved by at the time I was putting each individual bit of paint down. I was going for the colours of this bit of skin or that bit of skin. But I know his aunt, when she saw it in the framers, said, she mentioned another artist, and she said, that artist paints people to look nice. Now, I painted, as I say, somebody that was incredibly attractive, and he told me that very often women do feel like this about people with his condition. Why that should be, I don't know, and that's perhaps a side issue. But James, what did I paint?
I'm going to let James answer. He's not going to answer straight.
I'm particularly interested to know whether the portrait painters here who have done portraits of people with disfigurement feel that they are they have a purpose, whether they, a bit like the Changing Faces campaign, they're actually trying to make some difference beyond the beauty of disfigurement.
Yeah, is there a campaign through each portrait, I think? Absolutely. I think our final question...
I'm a couple. I'm actually a volunteer at Changing Faces. And I just want to do it in the campaign, this supporting campaign. I was proud of the difference. The reason being, if I look normal, I wouldn't be in this campaign. Okay, and I would have a boring life. And I look different, and it strikes me in the tube, and it strikes me with magazines, and it's an amazing experience. Looking different for me is a really good thing.
Thank you. I think we've got the gist of the importance of celebrating difference and why we should celebrate that together, and I think we would all share that. Now, I think we're going to we've got time for a drink afterwards, so it's time for informal mingling and chatting and more questions. But I'm going to go along the panel, and I know each will try and answer relevant questions as they can, finishing with James, who's going to answer his question, pointed question from Daphne, and then I think James is going to wrap up with a little bit more final comment. But Alastair, final answering questions or final point from you?
I'd like to return to the issue of photography. I'm all for photography as a different way of looking at people and looking and using things. I think the instance that we see here with portrait painting is one where you've got sustained observation, which is a different way of going about it, perhaps not one which is less valid than what you're saying. But the fantastic thing about a painted portrait is the fact that you get to spend a period of time with someone and you're literally sifting through time. So the process is one which is seen to be organic, that absorbs information and then disposes of information once it sort of discounts itself as being relevant or not. At which point you absorb something else happening and that starts to get built in as well too. And it either stays or goes. And the whole process is one which sifts or filters through time to produce one round image at the end of the day. I think there are issues to do with physicality with painting that maybe aren't necessarily there in photography, and the comparison between the skin and the blood and the veins, perhaps going into some of Brendan's areas, but also some of the way that Taya might well look at the physicality of the way the paint is applied, or certainly the way that Jenny Saville might well use the paint, especially in light of this recent issue to do with the Manic Street Preachers cover as well too. So there are issues to do with the kind of the commonality or why paint is appropriate to document people in. My particular approach is the one where we would filter through time, and that's what really it's about for me. It's a design process, I suppose.
Thank you. Marc?
The question about whether I saw something more in the picture than just a depiction, something sort of the inner me. Yes, I did. I was really happy with the result. That's what I'd hoped to see. And I think we have to, when we talk about photography, I think there is a distinction between pure medical photography and photographic portraiture. I've had both done, but I've never spent 4 solid days being examined, questioned and prodded and poked by a photographer in the same way that Alastair did, figuratively at least. So there is a slightly different process. But yes, I'd hope to see something different. Perhaps it's partly to do with the physical mechanics of doing a painting, the fact that you're actually layering on it is actually almost a 3D image, and I was hoping that was going to project something a little bit more about me than the majority of the photographs I had done, and yes, it did.
Very good. Heath, final response?
Final response. Well, I agree entirely. Art is an evolving of the subconscious, over which I don't think the painter has an awful lot of control over what the outcome, but it is a subconscious interaction, and what comes out is the message. And I think art, to answer your question, the campaigning is such an important part of art. We as artists have the power to communicate in such a direct way, because you look at a piece of art, like a piece of music or a piece of poetry will get you right here instantly. And we're so lucky as artists that we have the chance to speak out about things that we feel really passionately about. And I think we should be using it as a tool. I think art should be used as a tool. That's
very good, very clear.
Yeah.
Michelle, final response?
I also want to echo my support for photography. I think it is actually a medium, well, for one, that I'm very much interested in. I've been the subject of many photographs, albeit mostly taken by my now husband. But I did want to draw a distinction between my experience of medical photography and photography for other purposes. Just as an anecdote, and very, very brief, I had the pleasure of being followed around my college a couple of years ago, being photographed for an article. This was the photograph that was going to accompany an article in Metro, the London Underground newspaper. And for those few hours that we spent, or I spent with this photographer traipsing around, we really did get to know each other in a way that was so very different to the experience of sitting in a clinical medical photography studio, where it's less important to really, it seems anyway, get to know the subject or put the subject at ease. They do a fantastic job in actually getting the information that they need. But it wasn't at all intended as a criticism of photography as a medium. In terms of the message, I wasn't actually as clear about the message that we wanted to actually broadcast through the portrait, and it was more of an evolutionary thing, I think, for me. I mean, I look at the portrait now, and I remember a time when I was feeling hesitant, but also really quite pleased and at peace, and also really quite surprised that I had established this new kind of relationship, one that was completely different from any other one that I had ever had. So it was quite fundamental.
Michelle, thank you. Brendan, final word.
I was quite interested in what you said of sorry, I don't know your name, of do paintings have jobs to do? I think they do, and I would release a painting when I feel it has its own life that can carry on. I don't believe that you can have it should have like a meaning in a literal sense, but I think a feeling, and I think it could unlock feelings. If it does that, then it's alive and it's working. And that can continue, and it goes off and does its job. And if that happens vaguely the right way, then that's a good thing. I did want to answer Ty's question, but I kind of forgot what it was.
I think Taya's was part.
The artist is really,
nice or truthful?
No, just the balance of our, we just want to feed our eyes. We want to find an excuse to paint, basically. That's all. We really want to find something to get out.
I mean, my own opinion on that, which is probably different, is I think it comes to a point when you can do it. You can kind of draw, you can paint, you can do whatever you want, and it becomes less interesting, certainly to me, when you can do it. And so you have to look for something else. You have to look for that other, the thing that you can't see that makes it interesting. I don't know what you think about that. But
I'm just interested that there's a danger in it. That's all.
We'll pick it up informally. Jonathan, final response.
I thought I was really interested that two artists in the audience have both sort of talked about finding people with different faces, people striking and different looking people, finding it fascinating, finding the disfigured beautiful. I think that's really the thing myself that I would like to hold on to as where the road to liberation lies here, because it seems to me that the deepest problem here is to do with invisibility, to do with this person looks appalling, they should be kept in a back room, they should be out, they shouldn't be in the public gaze, they shouldn't be seen, children shouldn't be seeing them. And I think that is the real deep sort of, I remember a long time ago that I remember at the time of the King's Cross fire reading something in a paper. I don't know why this sentence stuck in my mind, but saying, people who will now be backroom boys, men and women. They'll have to hide themselves away, sort of thing. And I suppose the thing that art could really do is, really could make it's about making the diversity and richness of real faces visible, and we all, and as you said, we all look different. Everybody looks different. Nobody looks conventional. Nobody looks normal. There's no such thing as a norm. And I think fascination is the key. And I talked about Leonardo da Vinci, and I feel I have to apologise to Leonardo da Vinci just briefly because I said that they're cold images. But Leonardo was what you were describing as seeing the man on the station. That's exactly what people say. Vasari says that Leonardo used to actually follow people around in the street who had strange faces, and that seems to be true because in his notebooks he does record seeing Giovannina, fantastic of face, in the hospital, and so those drawings they're not kind of positive images, but they are a record of a fascination by the greatest artist perhaps who ever lived, and he was clearly fascinated by this. This side of human experience, this side of human possibility, and I think contemporary art has got a great record of exploring extremes and the unusual, and this is something where art really could play a great role in making this visible and in just breaking down these sorts of fears that people have. So anyway, that's it.
Jonathan, thank you. James, you want to have the final word?
Well. It takes me back to a social anthropologist who, Frances Cook McGregor, followed a lot of people after the Korean War. She followed a lot of American veterans back into society. And what she observed of them, and they had facial disfigurements, was that they had to live with this terrible combination of one being an object constantly. They lost their civil inattention that everybody else takes for granted. The civil inattention that most people can walk down the street and not be noticed, but if you have a disfigurement, you are noticed. And at the same time of being terribly isolated. That the sense of being stared at and not making relationship is something that I think we hear time and every day from people who contact us. And it's that isolation thing, I often call it sanctioned staring. I have to sanction staring in order to allow people to get to know me. And I think Michael Palin is absolutely right. That's what portrait painting allows. And what we have to do is to allow, in our generation, portraits of all sorts to come back into the milieu. Because I think there has been a sense of, oh no, we couldn't paint, war heroes, yes, and that's what we're trying to break through. Daphne, just to conclude,
I think
Daphne
wants the answer.
I know she does. And the answer is that in realizing my isolation early on, and you will know, it was easier to stay in that student room than go out. And I had to find a way of getting over the obstacle of communicating with other people. And you will probably have seen me struggling to say, now, how do I start the conversation? How do I get into the room? Because otherwise one's left outside. And I think what you were seeing, probably, Daphne, is that I had adapted my communication skills so much that they were coming out of every pore in my body. And I'm afraid to say that's what it's about. And you painted...
That's the problem with the portrait painter. You're looking for clues, and looking for visual evidence. And that evidence, that's why I don't know what I painted, because I was using that evidence, but it hadn't got a lot to do with you.
Ah, well, you painted colours, you see, and I was expecting to see the picture come with scars all over it. And there were no scars, it was just colours. It was incredibly clever. And that normalised what I was in a way that was fantastically respectful. If I had had a picture with, scars, scars, it wouldn't have been what was me, because I'm not like that. Can I roll up? Because you might want to say a few words.
Well, you say your words, and I'm just going to thank everybody, but final words.
Well, I was going to thank you first for chairing such an excellent conversation. Can we thank Sandy? Thank you. And can I just do a few more thanks? Firstly, Marc and Heath and Michelle and Brendan and Jonathan, thank you all for coming and sharing your experiences and your insights. Thank you to Alastair, not just for painting, but for being the president of this august society. And it is a unique relationship, and we value it hugely, and we will go on, please. Please don't think we're dropping the prize. Uh-oh. Sorry.
We'll discuss
Sorry,
this later.
Christy. But most of all, thank you to all of you for coming. Incidentally, I should say, too, thank you for the filmmaker. Thank you to Alison and all the team behind. Thank you, John, for organising and helping everybody behind the scenes. But most of all, thank you for coming, because I have to say we were a bit nervous about, come on, this is a slightly off-the-wall subject. But no, it's got 100 people in the room, and we've had what I think is a fascinating conversation. What I'd like to hear from you, not now, because we'll wrap it up, but how do we go on having these conversations? Can we take this somewhere else? Can we take it into schools, into other cities around Britain? Can we start these sorts of conversations? And if you know or think of some way in which you can help us do that, will you contact Alison here, or Rekha, or any of my team, or indeed Alastair, yes, or me? Let us have those conversations. The theme for me tonight has been relationship. And I think that is such a central part of portraiture. And please, it can also be part of photography. Please, I'm going to be in deep trouble if I don't say that. But thank you all very, very much for coming. Do you want to say anything more, Sandy?
No, just to say, fascinating evening, and thank you also to the panellists and all of you, and indeed the Changing Faces and the Royal Society of Portrait Painters. I think there will be more conversation, and I look forward to it as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.